questions or continued presentation. So without further ado, Loyd Auerbach.
And the camera's working? Thank you, Jon. I swear, Jon, one of these days I've got to hire you as my agent to say such nice things about me. Okay, how many, this is kind of an odd group to be asking these questions of, but how many of you believe in ghosts? Raise your hands. Okay, how many of you believe in phony psychics? How many of you believe in ESP? Raise your hands. How many of you believe in mind over matter? Raise my hand. That's good, okay. What I want to talk about tonight is actually kind of something that came to me as I was writing this book, and this was a different kind of book for me to write because it was more personal. I put a lot more personal attention into it. It's less fact-oriented in the sense that it's not a lot of research stuff. You don't read a lot about the lab. It's more about what I've experienced over the years, which is very, very different for people who've read my other books. And it also was a lot more interesting to me. But it brought me to a different position in terms of looking at psychic phenomena. And that position was that we've been overlooking a huge gap in our experience when we're talking about paranormal or psychic phenomena and dealing with mind over matter. And that is just definitional. Psychokinesis is the idea that the mind affects matter directly. We typically think of that as outside the body. But in reality, science has a good understanding of what neurons fire when certain activities are done. We certainly know quite a bit about what areas of the brain, but not everything, what areas of the brain are active during certain activities, during certain emotions, and different states like that. We don't know what it is that is the mind from a physical perspective. There is no physical evidence whatsoever for the human mind. It's all assumed, which is kind of interesting. And secondly, there is nothing that science can say about that intent. If I decide to raise my arm, we know which neurons can fire. We can actually track that back with sophisticated equipment. However, what is it that made those neurons fire? What is it that made the right neurons fire? That's the missing part of the equation. This is mind over matter. It's just a little different way of looking at it. So coming from that perspective, I kind of backed up. And I started looking at a lot of things that I had been interested in growing up, and also things that I'd worked on when I was at the American Society for Psychical Research years ago, including working with a couple martial artists, one of whom could move objects from a distance as part of the process of the martial arts. And I started figuring more and more and learning more and more about this whole idea of pushing oneself, the whole mind-matter thing that's hitting sports, that's hitting health. It's all part of this whole basis of psychokinesis. And to say that moving an object at a distance is any different than perhaps an athlete pushing him or herself to superhuman or what we think is superhuman performance may not be the case. Let me give you a little example. This is kind of a stereotype story. A young woman is in a car crash with her young son. Car flips over a couple times, she gets thrown out of the car. What happens next? Well, the kid's trapped in the car. The woman, the mother, lifts the car or moves the car off the boy so that she can pull him out. Okay, now that's something we hear about. It's been in the media years and years. It's kind of hard to track down real cases like that. And the explanation for this always kind of bugged me. It's always adrenaline. Oh, it's adrenaline. Well, adrenaline speeds up the body processes. It may burn up more energy, but it does not do a couple of things that I learned when I just happened to be at a party bringing this up to a couple of doctors. I was with a friend of mine in Marin County a few years ago, and at the party was an orthopedic surgeon and a GP. And as it happened, I started talking a little bit about psychokinesis and I was curious as to whether either doctors had read anything in a journal about any case like this where someone lifted a car off. And it turned out the orthopedic surgeon had not only heard about it, he'd actually examined a woman about 2 years before who had been in this exact situation. Now, first of all, when she was thrown from the car, she was a bit bruised. She was scratched up. No broken bones, however. She was really not hurt that badly. This was a pickup truck, a small pickup truck that was lifted off. I asked a couple of important questions, which apparently slipped the minds of a lot of people. Number one, can the human body, the structure, the bone structure, the ligaments, the muscle, sustain holding up that kind of weight for any length of time? And the answer he gave me was no. She should have had broken bones, torn ligaments, ripped tendons. Secondly, did she? He said no. Nothing was wrong with her. I said, well, what's your explanation for it? He said, I don't know. I have no idea. I said, and did you do anything about it, like do any more studies with her? Were you curious? Not really. Now that, as an orthopedic surgeon, think about this. You're an orthopedic surgeon. You're there to help people's bone structure get better. Here's a person who comes in who does something clearly impossible, and you're not interested in finding out why her bones didn't break? there's something wrong with modern medicine, because that's the reaction that many doctors have to situations like this, when people can perform unusual circumstances. In 1954, Roger Bannister did something that no one had ever done before. He broke the 4-minute mile record. Physically impossible, said all the sports people. Couldn't be done. Within a few months after that, a couple dozen people had done it. Why? I'll give you a quote from a good friend of mine, my friend Martin Caidin. What someone can or cannot do is absolutely not proportional in any way to anyone else's belief or disbelief. It is proportional to your own belief. All right, that second piece was actually my corollary to that law. In other words, the people saw that it was no longer impossible, so they did it. Okay. In the early 1900s, and this is kind of a mechanistic example, in the morning of a particular day on the East Coast, it was, according to all science, all over the world, it was physically impossible for heavier-than aircraft with a motor to take off from the ground and sustain flight. Impossible. That afternoon, it was very possible. In fact, it happened when the Wright brothers were right. Before that, about 100 years ago, a young man was thrown in jail overnight because he dared to try to actually pass off a device he claimed where people could talk to each other over a long distance. Okay, he was thrown in jail just overnight, fortunately. But the New York Times ran an editorial saying that even if this device worked, there'd be no practical application outside of carnival sideshows. Okay? What someone can or cannot do is absolutely not proportional in any way to anyone else's belief or disbelief. You have to believe you can do it. It's that mind push that allowed Roger Bannister to not pay any attention, to not care about the clock, to do those sorts of things. And when someone goes through certain peak performances in sports, it's the mind push. It's the mind that allows someone to actually beat the clock, so to speak, to actually pass those limits. People are trying to break limits all the time. And that's why we have a Guinness Book of World Records. And that's why we have the Olympics. People are trying to consistently pass these limits. And consistently, we are told as a human race by people all over the world that you can't do something. From the time we start growing up, we're told, can't do that. Can't happen, won't happen. A friend of mine years ago told me about a story when she was about 2 to 3 years old. She remembered vividly this, and she actually had her mother talk to me about it. She remembered somehow drawing a 6-foot-tall rabbit with crayons on the wall. It's a 2-year-old, right? Okay. Her mother said there was no chair there. She couldn't figure out how she did it. What she remembered, what Vicki remembered, was flying. She remembered having a dream of flying, and the next thing she knew, she had the 6-foot-tall rabbit that was drawn. I thought maybe she'd seen the movie Harvey or something like that. But her mother could not figure out how she did it. However, the mother didn't really ask how she did it. Her mother just said, don't do it again. Ever. And, of course, she never did it again, and there was never any explanation for that. Well, how could she have done that? Maybe she was really clever and had a reaching pole, as some certain skeptical magicians might say, or maybe somebody came in and did it for her. But I like to think that maybe she did it herself. What you believe someone else can or can't do hasn't got beans to do with the doing, or lack of doing. This is Martin Caidin again. Just go back through your history books and you'll discover that just about everything we take for granted today in our daily lives was absolutely impossible or highly improbable not so many years ago. It shouldn't be happening, but it is. Things are going on all the time. The problem that people have, though, about ourselves, about the way we react to the universe around us, is something that science fiction writer David Gerrold said, which is the hardest lesson to learn is that learning is a continual process. Science is a continual process. And when we take a look at mind over matter, at this concept, we have to start looking in different niches. For decades, people have been interested in psychic healing, for example. Psychic healing works on 2 levels. Let's talk about this for a second. On one level, when I heal myself, if I get better at something physically, for no explicable reason other than I'm getting better, and perhaps faster than normal, that's because I have this will to get better. I somehow will myself to get better. And if a doctor had given me a sugar pill under guise of medicine to convince me that I will get better, and I do, that's called a placebo effect. Ask a doctor how the placebo effect works. The answer is, it's the placebo effect. That's the explanation. It's the placebo effect. It's well documented. It happens. That's how it works. There's no explanation for it. And there's no interest in finding the explanation for it in a lot of modern medical sciences. Of course, the drug companies are not terribly happy about it. So that creates some problems there. when we're looking at developments, we have to really ask a lot of hard questions. In psychic healing, we're looking at a couple of questions here. I worked years ago with a man named Alex Tannis, who was a psychic in New York, who, among other things, worked with the FBI and the police up and down the East Coast. He was not very well known because he had been asked by police, and I was actually at a couple sessions with some Boston PD people who came down to consult him. He was asked to keep it quiet, and he did, because he had a family fortune. He basically didn't need to charge money for anything he did. He actually flew himself back and forth from Maine down to New York City to participate as a volunteer in research. Didn't even get paid because he had a lot of money. And Alex, another part of his life was to do psychic healing. Now, he had, I think, possibly one of the few people ever in history to work under the guise of being prescribed by a hospital as medication. He worked with a couple of doctors at Bellevue Hospital in New York City with cancer patients. And they would put him, he was part of the gamut of treatments that they had, because a couple of doctors with terminal cancer patients felt, what the hell? You know, why not? If these people believe in this, let's try it. So Alex went in, and he had a number of great successes, and he had a number of failures, too. But the key factor seemed to be how people actually reacted to him. He was a very charismatic kind of guy, and people often reacted very positively to him, and some people just didn't like his pushiness, because he was kind of a pushy guy, too. You will get better, he told them. And if they didn't want to, they didn't. So there was kind of a two-pronged thing here. But Alex once said that even though he believed he was having a real effect on these people, that he was putting out some kind of energy to heal them, he said, you know, it would be really interesting to bring an actor in to play the part of Alex Tannis to see if it was that placebo effect, that it was the will for these people to get better, and that he was just simply the trigger that caused them to get better. And that's a good question. On the other hand, Olga Worrell, who was a very well-known healer, was studied by a number of folks, including Bernard Grad in Canada and Dolores Krieger in New York. And among some of the experiments that she did, she was given flasks of enzymes and asked to create an effect to speed up the process that the enzymes were going through. She was also given flasks of blood hemoglobin to increase the hemoglobin content and the oxygen content in the blood. Now, placebo effect on an enzyme is a little different than a placebo effect on a human being. One would have to assume that the enzyme doesn't think too hard about this, but Olga had an effect, a very dramatic effect on the samples. And one of the researchers, actually Bernard Grad, had told me that it was a very similar effect to taking the samples of enzymes and passing them through in a very, very intense magnetic field. So similar, in fact, that they tried to use a magnetometer to determine whether or not she was giving off magnetic radiation. And she wasn't. So it was very similar to that kind of effect, but it wasn't the same kind of cause. So she was putting out something, or the enzymes were succumbing to the placebo effect. And they had a little bit of mind over matter on their own part. Then again, it could have been the experimenter who was causing the healing of the enzymes or changing the enzymes. And this is where we kind of get into things in parapsychology, is who's really causing the effect when an object moves across a room? Is it the person who's focusing on that spoon that needs to bend? Or is it the whole room that's watching, wanting that spoon to bend? Does Uri Geller really bend spoons with his bare mind? Or is it the entire audience that's watching him, which causes him to be so surprised that it bent that maybe he really did do it, instead of trying to play around with it a little bit? Another science fiction writer also said, and this is a kind of an couple of important quotes here, Kathleen Sky said, "There's no such thing as a supernatural. There are only things we don't understand yet." And in looking at mind over matter, it's clear when you start talking to people about the mind-body connection, there's absolute acceptance. Placebo effect, there's a mind-body connection. Doctors know that somebody's got to want to get better, and people can will themselves to be sick. There's that kind of effect. But as soon as you start going past the skin, past the body, all of a sudden you now have a completely different ballgame. There's no way that the same energy that can cause the neurons to fire and cause bodily process can possibly affect things. Can't happen that way. Well, Robert A. Heinlein said, "Being right too soon is socially unacceptable." And let's talk about being right too soon. In the 7th century A.D., a man named Bodhidharma came to the hills of China and met with some Shaolin monks. And so began what evolved to become Kung Fu. He was there to teach them Zen Buddhism, but they also were beleaguered by a number of problem robbers in the hills. And so he taught them a little bit of a couple of Indian martial arts. Now, many people don't realize that in India there are actually martial arts that predate Kung Fu, that are very similar in nature. He also taught them a number of other things, and from this evolved that with the whole Chinese system of Qi, evolved a martial art that actually spread across the East and became other things. It evolved to different things. If you work or talk to martial artists who are truly into the art themselves, not just American karate champions who like to hit things and break them for medals, because there are two very, very different groups out there who do martial arts. They're the competitors who like to break things, who like to perform, and they still do amazing things. And then there are the folks who are kind of like the peaceful warriors. They learn the martial art for what it is. It's a philosophy. It's a method of keeping balance in the body. It's also a way of defending yourself and projecting out. And actually, unfortunately, it got canceled, but Kung Fu: The Legend continues, as schlocky as it sometimes got on TV recently. David Carradine's character every week was doing something I would consider falling right into the psychic category. But every single thing he did comes right out of books on Kung Fu. Everything. Everything from telepathy to walking up a wall with your back to it using the heel of your hands and your feet. Kind of like clinging to the wall like a spider. Those things are in a lot of books about the history of Kung Fu, and they seem to be very unbelievable things. Many years ago, before he died, Bruce Lee was very, very well known for something that has become legendary. It's either called the one-inch punch or the one-inch jab. It's been known for about one-inch blow. And what happened was he was at a karate, it was actually in a martial arts competition, and he was talking about his new art, Jeet Kune Do, which was synthesized from a number of other martial arts and involved a lot of chi, a lot of the use of the energy flow. And some American hotshot big guy came up and saw this tiny, scrawny guy, and if you've ever seen him on television or in movies, he's a small guy, very small, came kind of right up to him and said, "You can't do anything to me." He threw a blow from here. He hit the guy from here, and the man sailed across the room, according to witnesses, 12 feet. Now, I actually recently talked to somebody who was at this competition who actually saw it happen, and he said it was more like 20 feet, but his perceptions might have been off. Shouldn't have happened, but it did. And it was because somehow there was an energy flow from this martial artist into his target that sent someone spinning away with nothing happening. Certainly Bruce didn't even move back at that point. When you learn about the martial arts, you learn some pretty amazing things. My father was a producer for NBC Sports for a number of years. And as I was growing up, I heard a lot of things, strange things. He and his producer buddies, because they knew I had my interest in the paranormal, always used to tell me the strange sports stories. And I was shown at one point a videotape of a football that actually made a right-angle turn, kind of like a UFO, right out of the hands of the wrong receiver and right into the hands of the correct receiver. That was kind of a unique thing because there was no wind that day in the stadium. So maybe this was a UFO, a little small one. It's kind of disguised at that point. They decided that this is the team that should win. But that was kind of an unusual circumstance. There are really, if you watch sports, sometimes you see certain people almost go into an altered state. And in sports, an athlete will go into an altered state. And time slows down for these people. They can actually it's a shift in perception of time. But sometimes these producers and the folks from NBC would tell me that they could swear that they're watching everybody else slow down and this athlete just speed up faster than possible. Or they would see 5 guys jump on top of a quarterback, and suddenly the quarterback is not under the pile. He is on the other side of the pile running towards the goal line. They go back and they would watch this over and over again, and they can't see how this guy could have been a Houdini. He somehow was underneath, but then he was in front of them. And that's something martial artists talk about. They've talked about doing a lot of things over the years, and it all involves chi. And one of the people I worked with at the ASPR years ago in New York was a man named Guy Savelli, who's in my book. Guy is an American who was trained by someone from Red China. He was somebody who escaped the political regime of Red China and came over to the States and decided to start teaching things that, according to Guy, he apparently wasn't supposed to be teaching Westerners. The kind of the secrets of Kung Fu, but he decided that if people were interested and really truly interested in getting that far and learning the philosophy and really taking that to heart, both the positive healing process of the martial arts as well as the blows that one would throw, that it was okay. So Guy came and worked with us. He's a martial artist who actually has a school in Ohio. And he came to us claiming amazing things. And I talked to some of the witnesses back then. He claimed, among other things, that he could actually do this kind of stepping through space, though not always. His master taught him to do this. He said he actually saw the guy do it several times. So the man would be in front of him, take a step, and somehow be behind him, with somehow not getting, going right through him, just being in one place and then another. And Guy said the man taught him how to do it. However, he can't always do it because he doesn't really know how he does it. He kind of focuses on it, and somehow it just happens. But I talked to some witnesses, some of his students, who claimed that they actually saw him do it. Other things that he did sounded like something right out of a David Copperfield routine. He made his image disappear from a mirror for some prospective students, scaring most of them away. Kind of a mental illusion casting. He said that many of his students, as they kind of take on and learn the different modes, the animal modes that Kung Fu often trains, would also take on the aspects of those animals as they're doing the movements. And sometimes people would actually visually see a tiger or a dragon or a praying mantis superimposed over these people, as if the suggestion is strong enough coming out of the mind. Now, that's not really mind over matter. That's kind of mind over mind at that point. But then comes the other things. And what we had Guy do, among other things, was to affect, as scientists, we have to do small things. We can't have him, like, breaking something and doing and really videotaping that or checking for how much force was put into it. By the way, there's a film that exists somewhere in the archives of NBC that I can name. There's a dozen of producers at NBC and people who have seen this film. And it's actually been shown on television once years ago. It was 1,000 frames per second of a karate champion throwing a blow at a brick and breaking it. The brick broke before the hand hit it. Now, the explanation, according to some of the skeptics who saw that tape, was that the compressed air wave set up by the speed of this blow obviously broke the brick. Anyone who knows physics will tell you that's not possible, not unless you could have somehow built up enough compressed air for that. So how did it break before the hand hit it? Well, there's two possibilities. One, the hand actually struck it twice. The first time was faster than that camera could actually follow. I kind of doubt that. The other is that something broke it. And what someone in martial arts will tell you is you don't break the brick. You go from point A to point B, and if the brick's in the way, you just go through it. That's where the energy is. You go to a target, and that's the target. So we actually, as scientists, had Guy doing something really unique. We had him sitting in front of an infrared beam, and we had a candle on the other side, and we asked him to try to throw a blow at the candle, try to make a candle waver, and break the infrared beam. That's real exciting. But you can get that on a gauge, on a graph. And he did it again and again and again. He just simply would just throw his hand like this. The infrared photoelectric cell set up an I-beam right ahead of him, and time after time, it interrupted the beam. Something interrupted the beam. Nothing we could see. Yeah.
That's pretty remarkable.
It was very remarkable. Yeah. And the candle once did actually go out. So the candle was actually on the other side of the room. It was about as far away as David's camera back there. Then another thing he said he could do is he could throw the energy of a blow or throw the energy of a movement at someone. This is something that we always heard about. My father heard about from Kung Fu people and karate people. You could throw a blow across the room and knock somebody down. You heard that about Bruce Lee. You heard that about a lot of other folks. So he wanted to say that it could be done. So we said, okay, well, we can't have you in the same room because it could be suggestion. This is science. We're operating at this point, obviously. So what happened was we stuck him in an isolation room. He was watching a video monitor, and in another room was his target. That would be me. And I was supposed to move forwards, backwards, right or left, based on random movements. He was given a list of randomized movements, and every 15 seconds there would be a sound hit, and I would move however I felt if I felt any sort of energy or push in any direction. And what ended up happening was, over the course of that day as we did this experiment, 50% of the time I was moving in the direction that he was pushing me in. And at one point, the randomization actually caused 5 backward movements in a row. And the last one he decided, he said, this is actually what ended up happening in the separate recording that was going on. He said, I'm going to throw a really hard blow at Loyd and see if I can knock him down. And on the video of me, you could see me actually practically falling over. I actually fell over backward over the table that was there because I felt like somebody had given me a good shove back there. So I was actually feeling this as it was going on. Mind over matter. Either that or somehow he was projecting the telepathy, telepathic impression telling me which way to go. I felt it. It was a physical sensation that I felt.
What kind? Not in a specific localized point.
It was kind of like, somebody would if somebody took a pillow and put it on your chest and pushed you so you couldn't actually feel their hands. It was that kind of like amorphous pushback.
Somewhat localized.
Yeah, it was localized kind of the upper half of my body, but not really that localized at all. So, I mean, I've worked with him a couple other times since then, and more recently, he has been doing some real interesting work with the U.S. government. One of the more, I could say the negative things in martial arts is something called the dim mak, which in Kung Fu is called the delayed death blow. Some people have said that Bruce Lee died of this. This is a blow that one would throw where you actually shift the chi in a person. You actually throw a slap or a light blow at someone, but the chi ripples through the body and disrupts cells. And over a period of 24 to 48 hours, the person dies. That's a dim mak. It's an assassin's tool. It's kind of the dark side of Kung Fu. The U.S. Army, of course, was very interested in seeing if that was true. And they did 2 sessions with Guy, which at this point, he said he wouldn't do again. He did it because he thought he should at the time, but after thinking about it, he realized he really shouldn't have done it. He didn't realize what he was going to do at the time. They had 2 goats, and he was asked to slap them to do the dim mak on them. And within 24 hours, both goats died. And I've seen pretty gory photos of the autopsy, and the internal organs of these goats were just totally disrupted. So it's entirely possible. Now, let's move on here. What came out of that whole session was him teaching Special Forces people to do some techniques, but not that specifically. To transfer energy through things, to actually be able to think about a blow rather than practice the blow like karate often teaches. And so he sent me a videotape, which is like something right at, it's a Monty Python routine, actually. It's 3 staff sergeants from the Midwest, all with a slight accent, you know, big guys. Hi, I'm Sergeant Simpson, and today we're going to demonstrate Kun Tao. And it was very, very funny, actually. So these guys are talking. Kun Tao is actually this branch of Kung Fu that Guy teaches. And they started talking about the fact that they'd had their typical martial arts training for the Army. That's about it. They hadn't had anything special. They were not black belts or anything. Over the past year before this tape had been done, they'd been given literally reading to do and meditation exercises to do, visualization techniques that Guy had given them for mental training for Kun Tao. Then they demonstrated one of the techniques, which was called the whip. Now, the whip was a blow where you just flick out your fingers and hit something and it breaks. And think about that, your fingertips. So these guys are demonstrating this, and one of them holds up a big 2-inch thick board, and another guy just flicks it out and it breaks in half. Then they doubled it, broke it again. They ended up breaking cement blocks this way. They ended up taking, the more interesting one I thought was where they took a glass bottle, a beer bottle, stick it on a pedestal, the guy starts walking by. As he's walking by, he flicks his fingers at it, and the top half shears right off without moving the bottom half. Some kind of bizarre transfer of energy. Then they demonstrated a variation of the dim mak with a watermelon, which was, I thought was a much better use of it. They did 2 things. First of all, they showed kind of the whip technique where the guy just kind of flicked out his fingers and his hand ended up embedded all the way into here in the watermelon, which is kind of tough to do if you think about it without breaking your fingers. The second thing they did, took another watermelon and the guy walks up and he slaps it. And then they cut open the watermelon. It's total mush inside. Now, here's the other side of this whole process. It's for self-defense. It's called the shield. The same energy that can be projected outward to break things can shield your body from harm. In Kung Fu, it's often called the iron shirt technique, where someone can throw a knife, even, or a spear at you, and it will be deflected by the iron shirt that is your skin. It doesn't penetrate. So this shield, which is a variation of that, these guys now stand there, and one of them gets down on his knees. Guy walks out with this big 2x2, and he takes the 2x2 and he whacks it over the back of the guy's neck. And the guy doesn't move. But the thing breaks a little bit. Bends, he whacks it again. He hit him 3 times before the thing broke. Guy gets up, brushes himself off, he's fine. Guy walks out with a 6-foot steel pipe, about this big around. It was hollow. Big staff sergeant stands there like this, chest out. Guy takes the pipe, whacks it across the guy's chest. It bent a little bit. He whacked him again. It bent a lot. Guy's fine. They did a few more things like this, and these guys are coming out, and they kind of open their shirts. There's nothing wrong with them at all. They said that in combat, in hand-to-hand combat, with a technique like this, they can capture somebody because they can't hurt them. The enemy can't hurt them that way. Now, they weren't going to go so far as to say, shoot a bullet at me, all right, because there is that belief factor after all. But they did go through all this process, and it was really interesting to me because it shows the different piece of Kung Fu that we don't really see very often. It's how do these guys in these movies take that many blows? Well, of course, they're stuntmen most of the time. But then again, a couple of good blows should knock you over. Guy and other martial artists have told me that the key, if you had 2 masters standing at each other, they wouldn't fight each other. They would stand eye to eye. There would be a mental battle, and there might be 1 blow thrown by the winner. 1. If there was going to be even 1 blow. Typically, two true masters would not even throw a single blow. They would know mentally who won, and then one would bow down. wouldn't be terribly exciting for competition, would it? No, it's two guys go, oh, whoop. Hey. In the early part of the century, a guy named Morishi Uyeshiba developed something called Aikido. And Aikido is a synthesis of a lot of martial arts. Anybody here take Aikido training at all, ever? It's kind of an interesting thing. Aikido says you can't hurt me because I am the universe. We are the world, we are its children. You know, I am the universe. And nothing can hurt the universe. You know, Aikido goes with the flow of the universe. So when somebody throws a blow, Aikido is an avoidance technique. You know, if somebody throws a blow, if the blow even connects, you're actually moving with it. And all force in return is actually as a response to that avoidance, so to speak, because it's the flow, the ebb and flow of the universe. And that technique is an amazing technique for self-defense, but it also channels energy of a blow around and through. I don't know if, Ruth, you probably remember, and a couple of other people might remember, a few years ago we had a martial artist friend of mine come and do a presentation over in Berkeley, and he had one of his 14-year-old students stand there on stage, and he threw a blow at her stomach, and had somebody standing behind him hold it with his hands on the girl's back, and this man got pushed back, but the girl didn't, because the blow actually was passed through her. So it was mind over matter. She passed the energy of the blow straight through her. And our minds can affect our bodies that way and everything around us that way. Now, the other piece of this, of course, is can we affect things outside ourselves? Well, martial artists do healing. Not a lot of them do, but certainly Shaolin priests do. Guy actually goes into hospitals and other circumstances like Alex Tannis did and uses his techniques to heal people. And he teaches right now he's teaching his healing techniques to the Navy SEALs so that they can heal each other in combat in the field, which is kind of, think about that. That's an amazing thing. If you can heal yourself and heal somebody else, there's a lot of circumstances you can get out of without having to worry about it. It's a very good commando technique to be able to do that. So this is where his focus is right now. All over the world, people are able to do these kinds of things. They're able to pass out energy from themselves. Shamans use techniques, various techniques, to actually provide energy around them. A friend of mine years ago, somebody I knew, was actually working with the Huichol Indians down in Mexico and was witness to essentially what amounted to a poltergeist outbreak. During a ceremony, the shaman was doing a healing ceremony, and she said that he did a few sleight of hand tricks, which is not unusual, but then all of a sudden, rocks, Coke bottles, litter, things started rising up into the air and whirling around everybody like a storm. But there was no wind. And it was almost like the energy of the people was causing this stuff to move around. And then when the ceremony was over, it all just dropped back down to the ground. Now, was it the gods that caused that? Well, maybe, if you want to believe that. Was it the people? Probably, I would say. And that's where we kind of move this whole energy thing into this idea of affecting things around us. Poltergeist activity, for example, is the key example of unrestrained psychokinesis, mind over matter, where the subconscious mind, which doesn't have the belief problems that the rest of us do, our conscious minds do, the subconscious mind says, oh, I can do this, and I want to do this because I got some steam to let off. I'm really mad about something. I'm stressed out. It's going to happen, and nobody's going to blame me because nobody's going to figure it's me. In fact, the way that we typically deal with poltergeist cases when things are happening is to find out who done it, or to bring a skeptic in, which usually settles things down right away also. Pretty easy way. Typically, the conscious mind recognizing that I may be doing this, the subconscious realizes, uh-oh, been found out. The conscious mind says, we really can't do this because it's not possible. And things shut down. But a number of folks at JFK, Julian Isaacs worked with a woman who had a poltergeist outbreak. She was a bartender. And he was able to actually work with her for months after, to a point where she was able to control it in a laboratory situation. And she was actually able to control it, according to her and to some of her customers, in the bar situation. What would happen typically is she would get very angry at the bar and all sorts of things would happen. And that's how the poltergeist case actually came to us. Well, after she learned to focus her attention on this and thought it was a really cool thing, you know, instead of thinking it's a scary thing or something that's not possible, whenever somebody would make her mad, the beer would dump over on that person. Or at one case, one of her patrons said that this one guy was really making her angry, and a pretzel bowl kind of picked up itself off of the bar, flew over to the guy's head, dumped itself on top of the guy. Then his beer fell over and onto his lap, and while she was sitting at the other end of the bar. Now that's a bartender. Bartenders work with spirits, you know, that's the way it works. These were happy spirits as it happened. Psychokinesis is an ability. It's what parapsychologists actually talk about, taking this energy past the mind, putting it out past the mind, past our bodies. And if one accepts that this is possible in the body and really starts looking at this, you can actually start considering all sorts of other possibilities. For the past couple of years, on and off, I've worked with a man named Martin Caidin, who I've mentioned. Some of you know who he is. He is the, among other things, is a science fiction writer who wrote a book and a movie called Marooned, which kind of predicted the Apollo 13 disaster, quite accurately, in fact, although Marty swears that it wasn't a psychic thing, it was just bound to happen sooner or later. He also wrote a book called Cyborg, which became the $6 Million Man on television. And over the years, he's become, he's an award-winning science journalist. His book, Journey Through Time with Jay Barbie, last year was about the Hubble Space Telescope. And Marty, years ago, I met him at a few years ago, I met him at a conference in Nebraska, and he claimed, as a science fiction writer, who, by the way, 2 nights before I had just seen on TV flying a plane and getting the world record for the number of people walking on the wing of a plane, because he's also a pilot. He had 90 people walking on the wing of a Ju-52 German bomber, which was a reconstructed bomber that he had found in the Peruvian jungles and rebuilt himself. 19 people is a lot of people to do wing walking and try and keep the plane actually steady. So here I'm going to see this guy talk, and he's claiming that he can move objects too. And I thought, okay, I want to see this. And we set him up at this conference with a situation where he had these little targets, and the targets are just simply pieces of paper folded so that they're kind of tented. They sit on top. You've seen this on TV. You sit on top of a pin. You know, they spin really well if you blow on them. If you wave your hand up, they spin pretty good. Put them under glass, they don't spin at all. And we set up a situation with some aquarium tanks. By the way, when his wife asked if anybody would like to help set the targets up, I was the first one out of my chair. Not because I disbelieved him, but because I didn't necessarily believe him either. I am a believer in psychokinesis, but skeptical about circumstances, because there is fraud and there is reality in all circumstances. And he actually had a couple targets turning under this aquarium tank. In fact, one of the targets turned for a good hour after it got going. So I worked with Marty, went to visit him in Florida, saw him. He had a setup in his house, his old house in Gainesville, which was an isolation room where these targets were set up behind a glass wall, and it was a room that had no ventilation in it whatsoever. And we went in, I set the targets up, made sure that there weren't little pinhole blowers in the table or any other circumstance, and he got these targets going. And then he taught me how to do it. And I got the targets going in a couple circumstances. We did a couple workshops, one of which was out here in the Bay Area. We've had some success. The one we did here, we had about 25% of the people turning targets under glass. In Nebraska, we had over 50% of the people turning these targets. Some of whom still can turn these targets.
Nebraska's better.
Well, it was really hot in the room that we had in Marin, and I think part of it may have been that it was very uncomfortable, and people were just not really happy about, if they wanted it to spin, they wanted it to spin and blow air their way. I think if we could have turned some fans, it probably would have worked a lot better, Marty's whole technique of this is, interestingly, he actually handed me a journal. And his journal said how he learned to do this. And how he learned to do this was 2 things. Number one, another science fiction writer by the name of Harry Stein, who wrote a book called Mind Machines You Can Build, which talk about these kind of things, challenged him and said, Marty, you're about the stubbornest guy I know. If anybody can move something with his mind, it's got to be you. Prove me wrong. And for Marty, that was a good challenge. The second thing was something you find in sports psychology and have in certain areas of sports for the past 40 years, visualization. Golfers have been using visualization longer than probably anybody except martial artists, because a golfer will visualize the path of the ball before he strikes, and there's 2 ways of looking at the ball actually following that path and doing exactly what the golfer wants. One, the muscles, recognizing exactly how the ball needs to go, may actually work to set the club correctly. The other thing is that the mind may have a direct effect on the ball as it goes. So the visualization is to get this target moving in your mind and not to really concentrate on it with your mind so much. It's got to just simply see it going. It's got to be that calm, peaceful happening that martial artists often talk about and that sports psychologists talk about. You may have to tense up your physical muscles to get some sort of reaction going, but it's usually the point at which you relax your muscles that things actually happen. And that's very similar to what Jack Houck taught years ago with the spoon-bending parties and what other folks have taught about for psychokinesis. And if you talk to people who do psychokinesis, it is the common factor. And it's just like what's going on in sports and what's going on in certain healing techniques. There is very little difference in teaching someone, in terms of the techniques that are given, teaching someone to do peak performance physically and teaching someone to do peak performance with PK in terms of the techniques. The only difference is what the target is. It's mind over matter in both directions. And when you look at it that way, it starts making a little bit more sense. Because we know we have an effect on our bodies, let's try and apply the same thing outside of our bodies. According to Caidin, the key is this. If you think it's impossible, you're not going to affect or move or turn a damn thing. If you believe it's possible, you're on your way. Let your mind be free, let it be unfettered. Cast off the shackles that our society and our science puts on ourselves because they're protecting themselves from new ideas, and amazing things will happen. But it all takes place in that great, great long journey between your right ear and your left ear. It shouldn't be happening, but it is. But if you remember, if you don't mind, it won't matter what the limits are. Breaking the limits is what human beings are all about. It's what we've been all about since the very beginning. Using our minds to break the limits, to say that, okay, we may not be able to lift a car yet, but even that's setting a limit. We can work towards that, as people have worked towards the 3-minute mile, or worked towards amazing performance in physical activity, or in artistic activity, or any other activity. PsychoKinesis is a real energy. It's the same energy that is chi. It is the same energy that may be called the Force in Star Wars. What that energy is, well, I put it to you that until science can come up with a device that can measure the thing that is the human mind, we probably won't ever know what that energy is. And at this point, we're done for a break. We're getting the high sign from a couple places here. Thank you. All right, let's take a short break, and after the break, let's come back and take some questions and talk a little bit more. I do have a few copies of my books up here, and my new audio tape, Ghost Stories.
Videotape would be better.
Well, you're not going to see anything but me on the videotape. Audio tape is much more exciting.
How many of the sort of anecdotal experiences that we just heard here are in the mind of
A lot of them.
A lot of them?
Oh, wait. I got to wait for him. I know you're ready. Come to Crazy Eddie's. Bye. And now for a commercial announcement. This is the first in a series of tapes. I will mention, actually, this is the first in the series of tapes. I'll be doing some Ghost Stories tapes. This one is some of my cases, and we'll be doing some other ones also. I've got a two-part, like I said, a two-tape set coming out next week on kind of an intro to parapsychology. And I'll tell you about a couple other things that are going on. There's some forums over there. We are taking the Office of Paranormal Investigations and kind of bringing it to the public, so to speak. One of the things I'll be doing is we're going to do a couple levels of membership to support the organization. And one of them, which is kind of the cheapo version, is going to be a monthly newsletter and a membership card as a supporter, news of a lot of different things that are coming out. And the second level, which we'll be introducing in a couple months, will be a field reporter status, where we're putting together a field reporter notebook for people out there in the world who want to actually participate, check things out, not necessarily be sanctioned investigators, but able to kind of provide us with things. And they'll be getting, as part of their package, 6 tapes, a T-shirt. We're going to do the whole thing. But then we're working also towards putting together a correspondence course so that we can actually train people long distance to actually be sanctioned as investigators for the Office of Paranormal Investigations. Because I keep getting calls all over the country in places that, I can't even think of finding anybody who might be able to do this sort of thing.
Who is doing this?
Now for the membership and such. And that's 1-888-444-1881.
That's 800?
That's it's the new 800 numbers. 888 or 800 numbers.
So
they ran out of 800 numbers.
Say it again, please.
3 8.
1-888-444-1881.
And the 415 number is?
415-553-2588. That's just our answering service.
And for people who can't afford a free number, is there a mailing address?
Yeah, for people who can't afford the free number, because they don't have a phone, and they have a problem, obviously, with communication, and they can't go down to the payphone. It's Post Office Box 875, Orinda, California 94563. Email for people who can't afford a computer but can't afford a phone to make a free phone call. Is best email for me right now that I'm giving out is capital L-O-Y-D, capital A, it's Loyd A, at AOL.com. I can give you my CompuServe address, I could give you my 2 other email addresses, but I won't. Okay.
You don't have a website?
I will have a website very shortly, but I don't quite yet. However, if you go to www.worldkungfu.com, www.worldkungfu, it's one word, worldkungfu.com, and you click on, and when you get there, you'll see information about Guy Savelli, and you click on his personal data, which talks about his paranormal experiences and affidavits about his paranormal experience. You'll see actually my book and information from the book, because it's linked in there.
So WORLDGUNGFU?
Yes, WORLDKUNG, worldkungfu.com. There's some really good stuff about psychic uses of martial arts there. Some really good information. With illustrations, that's right, including some of the affidavits from the Army about Guy's abilities, which is kind of interesting. It's got a lot of stuff in there, some of the testimonials from Army and other folks, which I found real interesting to read, considering the Army doesn't like to do that normally. But part of his deal was to tell people, you know, if they wouldn't give him testimonials, why the hell should he be doing this? It wasn't worth the money. You know, get some more students this way. So.
And the written box is OPI?
It's OPI. It's just Loyd Auerbach or OPI or Office of Paranormal Investigations. 875. I say 8. I say 875. Any other questions?
Any tattoo marks we should...
No tattoo marks. But I will say that on there's a couple flyers up here. One is about OPI supporter status. On the flip side is the information about the tapes. The other flyer is about a book signing I'm doing. I'll be doing actually another talk. But you've already heard it, so you probably won't come. But it's a week from Friday. And for those of you with kids or grandkids, this Friday actually at that same Barnes & Noble at 6:30, and then again at 8, I'm doing something for kids. It's the Goosebumps Club, and I'll be telling ghost stories and doing some magic, some spooky magic. So.
That's this Friday?
That's Friday night the 21st at Barnes & Noble in Pleasant Hill, yeah. And I am available for kids' parties, and that's a whole other thing. Okay. Okay, are we ready? David? Are we okay? All right. Let me just kind of switch tactics here, and since John put it, I'm on a roll, and talk a little kind of the other side of this whole coin. And that, you know, I wrote this book, and one of the things I've got in this book is kind of a statement to the skeptics and disbelievers out there that they're not going to like it. Consequently, I figure they'll sell more, because they'll trash it in their press, and basically, you know, they'll all buy it, which is great. You know, the next thing can happen, it gets burned by some religious group, and then it goes through the bestseller list. So, but please don't send this to Jerry Falwell, you know. This book actually, I changed tactics on this partly because of a skeptic friend of mine who said, you know, and who actually thinks that he's skeptical. I mean, he is truly skeptical in that he is looking for the information and will consider it, unlike many of the skeptics who claim that they are skeptical but are truly simply disbelievers. This whole belief factor will happen in all aspects. I mean, it's the whole attitude that the New York Times had about Alexander Graham Bell, and it goes on in science consistently when somebody brings up something, unless, of course, it fits in the framework that people are working in. I remember that back in 1983, when James Randi had just released information about his thing called Project Alpha, which was where he sent 2 young magicians into a laboratory at Washington University at St. Louis under guise of being psychics. He sent them in. They were studied for several years. Basically, they studied on and off for several years. Randi extremely exaggerated what was going on. He said that they were studied for 4 years or something like that, and in fact, it was 120 hours over that period of time. It's not a lot of time to be spent in the laboratory. They were never, in any publication or any meeting, the researchers never stated that these guys were psychic or even demonstrated on anything under controlled conditions. However, Randi had a big press conference for Discover magazine at which he basically said that they fooled these researchers. And that actually was one of the things that caused the lab to close, unfortunately, and the money to get pulled back. When that happened, that same issue of Discover, which actually had the article about it, I think right below the blurb was something about 3 physicists who won the Nobel Prize. Now, in parapsychology, when we look at statistical evidence, and we look at repeatable things, because that's what we're asked to do in the laboratory. And statistically, there is an enormous amount of evidence that indicates that there's some effect going on that indicates mind over matter. Okay, so there's this article in Discover magazine that talks about these 3 guys who win the Nobel Prize for finding a particle. Okay, a postulated particle. How'd they find it? By going through some like 3 billion cloud chamber photos, and on 2 or 3 of them they actually saw the particle trail. Now, I had a hard time with this. I have a background in physics. I had a hard time with this, with researchers saying there's no repeatable effect in parapsychology, and yet 3 out of 3 billion photos, which can be faked, because if this was a ghost photo, it would have been faked, obviously. So there's something wrong here, and that is that the paradigm under which we live will accept certain types of evidence, but not others. And that is what's, I mean, that is I think it's a mind over matter effect. I think that things don't happen because people disbelieve them. And in fact, I am convinced that many of the people I know who are skeptics, if they actually saw an effect happening, they would probably not see it. So, I mean, it happens all the time that people don't see things. All right? Of course, there is the opposite of the placebo effect. There's the nocebo effect, which somebody brought to my attention, which is, and that exists. That some substance, and this occurs, by the way, in things like voodoo and Santeria. The nocebo effect. You're given a curse, you're cursed, and you die or get hurt, get ill. Because your mind puts you in that condition. Works exactly. How does that work? Hey, it's the nocebo effect. It's it's psychosomatic. Okay, it causes a real physical effect, but it's still psychosomatic. How does it work? It's psychosomatic. The word itself is explanation. So as far as I'm concerned, when people say, how does psychokinesis work? I say, it's mind over matter. If you don't want to accept that, fine. Until you can prove to me the existence of the human mind, we're stuck. Now, that, by the way, that little bit, I just want to kind of give you a little aside, that came out of a Star Trek episode for me. Star Trek Next Generation, they had Data the android was on trial. Essentially, he was trying to prove that he was a sentient life form so that he wouldn't be taken apart. And at one point, Picard turns to the opposing scientist and says, prove to me I have a mind. Prove to us that I have a mind. Because there was no physical evidence in the 24th century, let alone the 20th century. And it's that point where we're dealing with science. There are many, many things. There was a great cartoon years ago I saw, which I use sometimes in lectures, of Leonardo da Vinci and an assistant standing there with a TV set holding the plug. Leonardo says, and then I realized I'd have to discover electricity and all that other stuff. Okay, so and he really, when you look at Leonardo's inventions, many of them are in action today. We just did not at that time have the technology to put his ideas into action, but they work. And just because something cannot be explained doesn't mean it does not exist. The Hubble Space Telescope has proven that, with photographs from places around the universe with things that were only imagined in science fiction. But they were accepted because as far as astronomers were concerned, there had to be black holes. Not that there was any evidence for them until recently, but there had to be them.
I don't know if you can answer this, but what kind of access do we have to photos from Hubble?
There are actually some websites for NASA you can get, yeah. And there's a couple books out. Marty's Journey Through Time is one of them. They're available to the public, through the Freedom of Information Act. Just that you have to go through the NASA process to get them.
Right, because I know for a lot of older NASA shots on various missions, you have to jump through hoops sometimes that they will make up.
I think they've been trying to make them available. I'm not sure of the website address for it, but I would check out the NASA site for that. Because I know that Jay Barbary has told me that a number of them, and also Roy Neal has said that a lot of them are available for that. And they are some spectacular, incredible shots, too. I mean, I've seen photographs of double star systems, which we sort of knew that they existed, but really didn't have a photograph of them. And now recently we discovered planets. First evidence that there are planets around a couple stars. That wasn't, we assumed that was going on, just like we assume that there's life out there, and there's got to be life out there. So we have to make assumptions in science constantly. We're trying to prove them. The problem is that in our Western scientific mechanistic world, the mind has been left out of this whole thing because the Industrial Revolution took over rather than other pathways we could have taken 100 years ago. So it's technology. Now, technology has been in use for thousands of years. What shaman use is technology. What a healer uses is technology. Herbs are technology. Technology is what we make use of when we learn about the world. Technology is not an end in itself. It's the application of what we learn. And technology is always changing. 40 years ago, the silicon chip didn't exist. In fact, science fiction writers completely missed the boat on that one. They didn't know. They didn't predict it. They did talk about something called a positronic brain. That's what Asimov did. that's still being tossed about for artificial intelligence. Nobody knows what it is, but sooner or later they'll figure it out. And whatever it is they'll come up with, they'll call a positronic brain because it's a great label.
Yeah.
It sounds good, you know, it sounds good. So we may find out that quarks and all those other subparticles that are out there are not the building blocks of the universe after all. There may be some other things that we're looking at. So to say that we basically limit ourselves by even saying that these things exist or don't exist, and by saying that other things do or don't exist. And really what we should be looking at is looking for the right questions to ask. I mean, the way the universe is set up, science is really not a search for answers. Science is the search for questions. We already have the answers. We just don't have the right questions to frame those answers. And depending on how you look at each situation, you can come up with different answers. Case in point. A couple of years ago, and John remembers this, a young man by the name of Ronnie Marcus came to our attention. A couple of you may have been at this session. He was an Israeli psychic who tried to be Uri Geller, but didn't have the personality for it. I think that's probably my overall comment about him. He had sent along to the States. He was brought over here by a researcher with money from a man named Alexander Imich in New York. He was seen in Israel doing some pretty amazing things, and I was given a list of the things he could do, or some of the things he could do in his demonstrations. To me, it read like a magic catalog. Now, I've seen descriptions of psychic activity, and they don't always sound like a magic catalog. But when I start reading descriptions of things, and it looks like somebody had written them literally for a magic catalog, I have to start being suspicious. For example, one thing that no self-respecting psychic would do, who really has these abilities, is something that a lot of magicians do, right? I mean, if you're wanting to be a psychic, you don't start doing things that you know the magicians do, unless you want to make your living as a magician but not spend the overhead on the effects. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, I have to be very honest with you. If I could really levitate and move things, I'd be on stage because I'm a ham. And in the background, I'd be trying to figure out what's going on with it. But I'd be on stage, I'd be levitating people, moving things around, and I wouldn't have to pay a cent to any assistants. I wouldn't have to buy thousands of dollars worth of magical equipment, and I'd make a mint because nobody could figure out how it was done. But I can tell you right now that magicians in the audience would be arguing about which technique I used out of the catalogs. Guaranteed, because that's how magic typically works. So one of the things that he had on his list, was my light bulb kind of flashing off, was that he could drive around blindfolded. Okay? Let me read you something.
Good book.
From the good book. It's actually from a different good book, but Sightless Vision by Ravello. You've read about it, you've heard about it, you've seen it, now it's yours. The blindfold act that's been baffling television audiences. Just think, the audience places a piece of cardboard over your eyes, then plasters it with putty, dough, etc., and covers that with cotton and then adhesive tape. A blindfold is then placed over all of this, and if that isn't enough, a black hood is laced completely over your head and tied around your neck. Yet with this super method, you can drive a car, write and duplicate numbers and names written on a blackboard, play pool, ride a bike, pick out colors named, and scores of other impossible feats. Full instructions, including the hood. $10. $10? $10? Okay. That's from Tannen's Magic Catalog. It's a stunt. It's not a real good psychic stunt as far as I'm concerned. And that was the first it was a cue that this man either was not a great psychic because he didn't know what he shouldn't be doing, or something else was going on. Yeah.
What's the answer?
Can't tell you. No, it's not a hidden microphone. It actually involves something called well, I can't really tell you. How am I going to say this? How am I going to dance around this issue?
So the bottom line on this story, though, is the guy from Israel.
I'm getting to that. I want to say is that this guy when he came over, he was set up with 3 different circuits, 3 different setups. The first one was to meet with some scientists, some researchers in Berkeley. It was a very informal meeting. They had decided to set up some really loose controls. If he could be blindfolded, therefore he said he read with his fingertips. Okay, so if he could be blindfolded, he should be able to stick his hand inside a box in which there was a light, just in case his fingertips needed a light to read things.
He has a light touch.
Yeah, right. I'll use that next time. And and he should be able to read the serial numbers off dollar bills and things like, see what's in the box, things like that. I mean, doesn't that make sense? If that's what he's doing? No, couldn't do it that night. They did a few other things with very light controls. He could bend metal, bend steel, bend spoons. They had actually a spoon with 2 alligator clips kind of stretched between to see how much pressure would be put. Because the idea is, he said that he could cause the spoon to bend itself. Well, that meant because he couldn't put a lot of a heavy touch on it because he'd come out of the alligator clips, the only way it would work is if he stroked the spoon and then he pulled his hand away when the spoon started bending. Nothing happened. In fact, nothing happened at all under these light controls. Second night was down in Santa Cruz for a group of physicists, including Nick Herbert, who some of you may know of, and a group of other folks down there. And I had been asked to actually go down there and as a magician / parapsychologist, but I couldn't because of a conflict. So I asked a couple of my buddies, who were also actually, as it happens, referred to these guys by another party. The 2 magicians I sent down there, one of them, Steve Ewell, is one of the best sleight of hand artists that I know, and is a really good friend of mine who has had psychic experiences, by the way. So he was definitely not a disbeliever, all right, at all. He was no disbeliever at all. Dave Knapp is the other magician who went down there. He is a physicist at Lawrence Livermore Labs. And Dave is a skeptic in the sense that he doesn't necessarily believe, but Dave is actually one of those kind of golly gee whiz kind of guys. So he's, as far as I can tell from him, if he actually saw something happening that was real, he would jump all over it. He'd be so excited because then he'd want to know how it worked. That's exactly his personality. So these are 2 perfect guys to send down there. Well, they decided not to just go ahead and let Ronnie Marcus do his stuff. Just observe him. And one of the questions that Steve and Dave and I had talked about asking Marcus was what his purpose was in doing all this stuff. If he said, like Uri Geller had said, he wanted to be an entertainer, all right, the outcome of that meeting would have been very, very different. He wanted to be a healer and psychic in Israel. He wanted to be studied scientifically, which was his big mistake. Because now they were judging him for his psychic ability, not his entertainment value. Because they would have, even if they thought he was a phony, if he was a good entertainer, and that's what he wanted to do, they would have endorsed him up and down from that perspective. Well, the problem was that everything he did was very, very obvious because apparently he didn't even do it well. At the end of the session, what ended up happening was the researchers asked Steve and Dave to talk about what they had seen, and they were trying to be as polite as possible and not embarrass him. So they had asked him, if he wanted to leave, he could leave, but he insisted on staying. He wanted to hear actually everything was said. He got very huffy when they started explaining every little detail, and then in fact taught the researchers very quickly how to do most of the stuff, because it was pretty simple. And so consequently, when he came up back to our area the next night to Rosebridge Graduate School, he walks in and says he's not going to do any demonstrations. He's going to do a spoon bending party. Now, if anybody here, I know a couple people have been to spoon bending parties years ago. They were pretty hopping things. Everybody got up, moved around, tried to bend the spoon, yelled at the spoons. That's not how Ronnie Marcus did it. He was very, very calm and kind of boring. And that was his major failing, I felt. Actually, I should say that Steve and Dave's biggest criticism of him was that he was a lousy entertainer. That had he said entertainment, they could not have given him good marks on that. Because he had no charisma whatsoever. He just wasn't any good, and he needed to learn his magic a little bit better, too. So the next night, he ended up doing a spoon bending, and he had everybody holding a piece of silverware. And I videotaped. I was one of the 3 cameras that were videotaping, and I was not participating in the spoon bending. But he was talking people through a spoon bending, and as he's doing this, he is getting everybody's attention on the spoons that they've got in their own hands, and every once in a while, he does this with his spoon. And that's what I've got on my camera. He's actually bending it, but holding the bend in his hand, hiding it. And by the end, after about 20 minutes, and it was 20 minutes later, and it's a good 5 minutes since he even did anything funny with his own spoon, he's still holding it, it looks like it's okay, he starts kind of rubbing it and ends up twirling it, and it ends up being kind of twisted around, and it's an amazing thing. Now, in the meantime, I have to tell you one thing. The guy in front of me, his spoon flopped over. Okay, I saw this. He was, and it was Larry Dossey's brother-in-law.
Oh, wow.
Which was even more interesting, I think. And the guy's son is like, Dad! Nobody else's spoon even budged, which was really interesting, too. So, here we have this guy who's faking it, and something real that just happened right in front of my face. The tough thing, again, we had agreed that I wasn't going to expose this guy in front of everybody. I figured, I don't want to embarrass the guy if anything happened. But what ended up happening is when he revealed the spoon, he kind of looked at me, and I gave him a little nod, and I started taking notes down as to what time codes were on the camera, so I knew when to go back every time he made a bend, literally. And he came up to me and asked me what I was writing, was I taking notes for any reason. I said, well, I'm a writer for Fate magazine. I'm a parapsychologist, but I'm also a magician. And by the way, those were my friends you saw yesterday. And he like looked at me and then went back to his seat. And the next thing that happened after our break, John ended up, you lost your cool for one of the first times I ever saw. Well, you saw.
Compliments on that.
Yeah, it was great. It was great. He gets up and he says, you know, I'm sorry that things didn't happen, right? You know, nothing really happened here tonight. But sometimes if the group energy isn't working because there's a bad link in the chain, and we have a bad link in the chain, and he's kind of looking over at me, and I spoke up at one point. I said, that would be me. And John spoke up about the whole situation and kind of put things in perspective for people and pretty much chastised him for making excuses on this because he had promised the audience one thing, that they were coming there to see him do a demonstration, which he didn't do. And then several people in the audience actually said that they thought the spoon bending was real because I actually brought up the fact that it wasn't, and I ended up showing the tape to people. And then I ended up doing something else, and I'm going to try and do this for everybody. Let's see if I can do this right now. Okay. I borrow somebody else's key, but I hate to always do that. Go ahead. This is not a terribly useful key. Actually, before I do that, I'll take off my ring.
Why would you take the ring off?
Metal on metal. I don't want my ring to bend. It's my wedding ring. Yeah. And that'll hurt my hand.
Could you describe what you're doing?
Sure. I'll try. I'm taking a key off my key ring, and I'm going to actually try to... You zooming in on this, David? Okay. I'm going to try to project some energy through my hand. I'm going to use my chi. Show it to everybody. The key is, as you can see, let's see if we can get it to go any further here. We have one bent key. Of course, as those of you who have my book would find the answer to this, don't tell anybody you started with a bent key.
I saw the bent key on your key ring. Is it the same one?
It's the same one. So you actually spotted it. Most people right in front of their face would not see that.
See, now, I always
And-
thought it was the brass key, and this one looks like silver from here.
Yeah, it is silver, but you may have seen a reflection off the other key. Now, I actually bent this key, I think, like 25 times that night, over and over again. And now, here's the funny thing about this key. This key, as far as I'm concerned, bent psychokinetically, originally. I had been doing a shoot for Sightings. It was actually the first show, and they at the last minute changed the shooting schedule. They were going to come to my apartment and interview me the next day, and we're down at ITP in Menlo Park with Arthur Hastings doing an interview, and the producer says to me, by the way, I think we need to change this around, so we're going to come to your house tonight, your apartment. I'm thinking, I was going to go home tonight and clean up my apartment. I said to them, okay, you got to give me an hour head start here, guys. So I split out of there, drove home, put my key in the lock, open the door, pull the key out, stick my keys back in my pocket, and I'm feeling my keys going like this. And I was really stressed out. Pull my keys out, and this key on the key ring is slowly but surely bending.
And you didn't, there was nothing, it was...
I wasn't conscious. It was. Now, I've noticed under stress, I occasionally have little mini poltergeist things happen from time to time, and this was one of them. So, I mean, here I got this key that it was bent for real, and I had not actually, I've done key bending and things like that as a magician before, but I hadn't actually used this key. That key, that night, actually was kind of the key to the key. Kind of inspired me to do that, and I've done this for magicians, and they all thought I was using a different method. Every time I've done it for magicians, they always think, because magicians rarely ever look for the obvious. Magicians always look for complex, especially when they're sleight of hand artists. They thought I switched the key. They thought I did all sorts of other things. And in fact, I'm a really lazy kind of guy as a magician. So if I can find a way to do it without having to put out any energy whatsoever and no practice, that's for me. So people who knew me really well said, you must have started out with a bent key. Right away, they'll say that. Everybody else, especially people who've never met me before, are thinking, coming up. I mean, with really complicated ways that I've bent. They bent it against another key. That I bent. They had a key bender on a. There's a key bender you can get that actually is on elastic that goes up your sleeve. I could bend it on my buckle of my belt. A whole bunch of other ways, which are ways that other people have bent keys. But nobody who knows anything about this stuff would typically say you started out with a bent key, which is why I was able to actually reveal that in the book, because it's technically not a magic trick. It's just a bit of illusion.
I noticed where you were rubbing the key, it was hidden.
Right.
And I thought, well, maybe something is going on under there that was already going on. So you just were rubbing a key that was already bent, and then you revealed the part.
The idea is to actually change the angle. It's held straight.
I noticed it was coming like this.
Yeah, that's right, to change the angle, because that gives the illusion that the key is actually bent that way. I mean, magic and the way that fraudulent psychic stuff works, and that's very, very different than typical magic. It works off some of the same principles, but there's a whole area called mentalism, and even further area called bizarre magic, which involves seance effects and things like that, which really involve creating the milieu into which you can be psychic. Mentalists are not people who do magic tricks and then happen to do mind reading tricks sometimes. That's mental magic. Mentalists are people like the amazing Kreskin, who come out there and their entire routine is based on the fact that they are perceptive, or they're able to affect things directly, or able to pick up things from people's minds. That's what mentalism is. And some of them even go so far as to come out and say, do a whole psychic shtick. Cold reading, for example, is something that fraudulent psychics do and that mentalists do. There's a lot of literature on that. Cold reading, basically, for those people who are not actors, because the actors have a whole different meaning of that term. Cold reading is when you grab a script for the first time and read it. Cold reading is, I see you for the first time, and I make general statements and watch your reactions and go further and further towards specific statements. And a good cold reader is actually more apt to convince someone that they're psychic than a good psychic. Because a good cold reader knows the psychology of the acceptance of the information, whereas a psychic may just simply know the information. And I've seen this happen with good psychics against good cold readers. The other thing is that good cold readers actually, whether they know it or not, are good psychologists. Because they're able to pick out people's experience, what the problem is, boom, like that. And that's why some of the best psychologists are good cold readers, if they're willing to say anything. A lot of psychologists just sit there and go, what do you think? I can't imagine a psychic saying, so what do you think? To you. Yeah.
What about the disinformation people who may be working for the government, like Randy and some other people?
I seriously doubt Randy's actually working for the government. Randy has his own agenda. I say that Randy's unlikely to be working for the government for a lot of reasons that I don't want to go into here. But Randy has a very personal agenda about psychic phenomena, as do a number of the others. And most of the debunkers that I've met are coming from the perspective of they really don't want to believe this stuff. I've met a number of people who have said to me, if this was real, it would completely change the way they felt about the world, and they're scared of that. I mean, a lot of them are really scared. Just like some atheists have said, if God really existed, I am scared. Because if God really exists and I've been disbelieving in him, he's going to be pissed at me. That's right. That's right. So, I mean, it's real interesting that it is faith. I mean, I've contended this with some of the debunkers that, as have other people, and certainly sociologists who've looked at the whole phenomena of psychics and skeptics, that you have a polar end of the spectrum. You have the true believers who believe anything, and you have the true disbelievers who will disbelieve anything, unless it fits the book of science. That's their Bible. They're scientists, or it's something called scientism. Okay? So it's the opposite of creationism, you might say, in that respect. In fact, one parapsychological researcher actually called certain skeptics Shiite skeptics, or Shiite scientists, to kind of talk about the extremism, because that was the time that the Ayatollah Khomeini was actually putting out all this stuff. Because these guys were actually going out, I mean, think about it. This is like, they're religious fanatics in some respects. Some of them are religious fanatics. They're going out and they are proselytizing. They're besmirching the name of people who have a different attitude. They don't like to hear that anybody disagrees with them, and they try to convince you otherwise. And why? Because it's right. Not because it's true. It's the truth, so it's got to be right. And that's not the right way to go. Now, that's not to say that there aren't phony psychics, because there are lots of phony psychics. Psychokinetic activity, actually there are more phony psychics in the realm of the cold reading aspect than there are in the other area, although there are plenty of phony healers that are out there. But then there are plenty of phony doctors. Let's start talking about the reality here. For every one phony psychic, there may not be one phony doctor or a quack out there, But there probably are some negligent doctors out there for every single psychic, phony psychic that's out there. Okay? There's certainly some bad lawyers for every psychic.
There's also a book that just came out about why people won't heal. Won't heal.
Won't heal. Oh, that's interesting.
It's Carolyn Mace.
I'll have to pick that up.
Carolyn Mace's book. Anyway, she's at, I mean, then just at Friday and Saturday, next Friday and Saturday in downtown Oakland, she's doing a two-day workshop. It's really interesting.
The other side of this last question about that mentioned Randy, which you pretty much dispensed with, I was thinking the other side of that was he mentioned agencies. So we've got PsyTech on the private level and whatever question.
Yeah, well, I mean, PsyTech, as far as I'm concerned, Ed Dames and his group don't know what the hell they're doing there. I mean, I don't know if they may be disinformation. Then again, they just may be schlock artists. You know, I don't know. But they've certainly made a lot of statements that they can't back up at all.
Anything to any residual, as far as you're aware, or ongoing even work done as far as you know by or through the hospices?
Not that I'm directly aware of. I'm sure that I'm sure that there is research going on. Certainly they had Guy Savelli come in and do a little thing with Dim Mak, on the goats. I would consider that of the psychic ilk. I think they were approaching it a little differently, perhaps. The CIA dumped the whole remote viewing project. They didn't want it to begin with. They only had it for a few months. They didn't want it. The Defense Department had it. Department of Defense, DARPA had it. And the CIA, the new CIA, the non-Cold War CIA, didn't want to have any connection to weird things like that. That was their attitude.
I can understand
well,
that, but privately, I have a hard time with it.
Except that I have it, from some good people that's unlikely that they're actually even doing anything. However, it doesn't mean that DARPA is not doing anything on the sly, or that other folks are not doing it. It was no worse and no better than a lot of other intelligence gathering techniques, but that doesn't mean they're going to use it.
Less risk.
Perhaps less risk, but they still had to back it up with real information.
Yeah.
And they still had it was simply just another backup tool that they had.
Well, for sure.
So, I mean, it's going on, I'm sure. I tend to think that there's probably more secret research going on in business. Do you all know that Sony Corporation spent $10 million over the past several years doing research on parapsychology?
Beverly Rubik, I spoke to her on the phone within the last week. She said that she's going to be meeting over there in Japan with Sony. She said she's glad this is the first time they're going to come out of the closet. So
well, they came out of the closet last year.
About their ESP program.
Right, they came out of the closet last year. The founders of Sony a few years ago started something called the Institute of Wisdom, which was more of a philosophical, metaphysical approach to things. And nobody really knew what they were doing. And because of the the cult slayings that had gone on with the subway gassing, they decided that they better start talking about what they were doing because there was some suspicion that maybe they were involved in that. So Sony is talking about it. They are working on various healing devices. They're working on also some ESP technology type things. They're trying to approach that, and they're trying to really figure out how it works. And $10 million is not a lot of money to spend over a few years, but when you only have 5 guys working on it, $10 million is a lot of money for five guys in Japan. That's a lot of money. That's more money than spent on parapsychology in the past 30 years for 150 people. And there's no signs that they're going to discontinue that. And in fact, I have a friend with the Sony radio network who's trying to actually get to his parent company and see if he can get them to put up money, like Randy's challenge, but on the positive side, which would be a really interesting way to go. Hang on, Gary, I'm sorry, Gary?
Yeah, I was just wondering, that's what I was going to get to. Has Randy ever given away that $1 million?
No, he never had it. He had $10,000, which I should say, according to several people, Alex Tanis actually had challenged him on the air to show the check just after he had said he had the check, and he didn't have the check. It was in another wallet, I guess. Right now, Randy is up to. Randy has, through the auspices of some other skeptics, has pledges amounting to over $600,000 for the same thing that his $10,000 was open for. However, I have to say 2 things. One, as of a couple months ago on the internet where Randy was talking about this pledge, even his original $10,000, because his legal troubles lately, he didn't have that, so all he could do was a promissory note. Secondly, the money is not an escrow. It doesn't exist except as pledges. The June issue of Fate, I had an article about Randy's challenge and why no self-respecting psychic would even consider going for it. Even if they could win it, they'd then have to sue everybody probably to get the money. Because Randy's the other part.
That actually happened though, where there was something that happened over in India, where the guys were walking over hot coals or something.
Oh, he did a TV special. There was a TV special where he was watching some guys doing hot coals, and he couldn't figure out exactly how they did it. So he basically said he'd been buffaloed.
Yeah.
That was his response. Now, they weren't going for the challenge, so it was a little different.
That was a pre-Buffalo era.
Yeah.
What's going on with Skeptics magazine?
Out of L.A., I'm not quite sure what they're doing with it right now. It's still being published, as far as I know.
Isn't Randy a part of that?
Randy's an advisor to that magazine, but he's not directly involved in Skeptic, nor is he directly involved in the Skeptical Inquirer. You know, you'll see his name as a fellow of Psychop, but that doesn't mean he's writing for the magazine at all.
It's called Psychop.
Psychop is the Committee for Scientific Investigations of Claims of the Paranormal.
Scientism, once again.
How do you, when you talk about the energy that's part of Kung Fu or the martial arts, how do you see that in the areas that are more benevolent, like Qigong, Reiki healing?
Well, you know, if you talk about balance, number one, a good Kung Fu artist, so to speak, or master, would be balanced internally. That means good health. And it's a matter of balancing his or her own qi. Putting the qi out for breaking things or for healing is the same thing either way. It's a directed use of the energy. It's a slightly different use. Yeah, I pretty much see it the same. So
Reiki, do you know Reiki?
I don't know Reiki really well, except for my couple of conversations I've had with Ruth Ingo. But I think you can look at therapeutic touch and a lot of the things. Acupuncture is playing with the energy system in the body, whatever that energy happens to be. I think looking or observing an aura may be the same thing. You're seeing that energy, and it could be connected to the electromagnetic field, could be connected to other fields. We go a lot of energies. We didn't know about the electromagnetic field, a couple centuries ago. We certainly didn't know about electricity a few. I mean, the lightning was all around us. So that there's different energies that we still have yet to discover. I don't think that they're non-physical. I think they're pretty physical. It's just that we don't have the physics with which to describe them or note them yet. But it's all part of the same thing. I think it's just different approaches to looking at the same energy and utilizing it.
But the trainings tend to be somewhat different.
Different approaches. You can get to New York through a lot of different ways. You can only get to San Francisco over a couple of bridges because that's how many we've built. But if you live outside of Manhattan and you hear that the Bruckner Expressway is clogged up, there's like 30 different ways you can still get into Manhattan. So it's just different approaches to the same destination.
Do you know anything of the work of the former Andre Puharich?
I know a little bit about his work with the sacred mushroom. And Andrea Puharich, also known as Henry K. Puharich, that's right, wrote a book, a very important book called The Sacred Mushroom in the late 50s, and then wrote a really good book on telepathy, and then started going real weird after he got involved with Uri. Claimed that Uri had been getting his power from aliens in a book, and as far as I know, Uri still says that didn't happen. So he got very strange also towards the end with Peter Hurkos and a number. He was on a TV show, in fact. Keith Harari appeared on with Hurkos and Puharich before their deaths, both their deaths. And Puharich and Hurkos both claimed many things about the government that were totally, totally untrue. It was basically about Hurkos, so I don't know what to say about him towards the end.
Hurkos is what?
Peter Hurkos?
Paul Hurkos.
Hurkos, yeah.
Passed away or not?
Yeah, they both died. Puharich died last year.
I heard that Puharich had a person who could look inside the electron and describe what she saw. And she could do it by
In the
slowing
electron?
by slowing down the rotation of the electron and then describing what she saw.
You know, the problem with that is how do you prove that what she saw was what was real? I mean, Ingo Swann, before we had the space probes out there, talked about the braided rings of Saturn and rings around Jupiter through his remote viewing. Now, if we hadn't sent probes out there, that would be totally useless information. But we now know that that was true. So the problem is that the vision of the electron, internal electron, may be exactly correct, but unless there's a way to verify that, it's speculation. Or to apply the knowledge, that's correct. It's not useless, but it's kind of like, okay, great. It's like honestly, moving those little paper hats around under the glass jar. It's like really cool, but what do you do with it?
So some of you may know the little book, I think it's called Anthrocentric Perception of Quarks by Stephen Phillips, who was a particle physicist who looked at the occult chemistry, theosophical book that was using micro-psi, where they claimed to zoom in and see subatomic level and then paint them and draw them. And there's a whole elaborated thing on the occult chemistry book that's been And Phillips got hold of that and then brought it to bear upon particle physics. He understood it as a PhD, traditionally trained. And the whole book that he wrote shows the tremendous similarity between the theosophical, the micro-psi gained information and the theoretical material from the particle physics. It's somewhat like the close relationship between the DNA codons and the I Ching hexagrams that's been shown by a number of different people.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of correspondences that are naturally things that people are picking up on, and the problem is they're overlooked, or we're going to have to kind of leave them where they are unless they can be applied, unless they can really be compared to something and shown as being real, at that point.
Maybe that's something else for Hal Puthoff to work on.
Yeah, I guess so.
He's a hands-on kind of person.
He is a hands-on kind of person, that's right. But he's got to develop something that will allow him to really kind of look that closely at this point.
The next step is to have something that you can put out there and produce for people to buy.
Right. Well, I think that's what Sony's doing.
Yeah.
The first thing they want to do is apparently something that works to play with your chi to make you feel better, called the Sony Pulse Man. I mean, literally, that's what it's called. It's the Pulse Man. That's what they're working on.
I have it right here.
Yeah.
Yeah?
I heard about Raytheon got the contract to put up radar emplacements all around the Amazon basin. And they say they're looking out for illegal immigrants.
Illegal immigrants in the Amazon basin?
Exactly. Raytheon exists. I've seen their
Oh, yeah, sure. Of course they do. Or maybe they're looking for the natives so that when they cut down the trees, they don't have to worry about where they are.
I don't know. It just does not compute.
Yeah.
No, it makes no sense. I'll have to take a look at that. And let me make a note, because I can research that one.
I listen to public television, public radio. It just seems so strange.
Well, maybe they're looking for UFOs,
Well, that would make sense. Not illegal immigration. Nobody wants to go to the Amazon basin. People might want to leave.
Oh, no, a lot of people, ethnobotanists, want to go to the Amazon basin.
They can get permission.
Yeah.
Right.
Are there other questions? I'll take a couple more and then...
Just want to, I didn't quite understand. Did you say that Uri Geller said that Puharish had made up
Pretty much,
all
yeah.
that stuff at the end of the book about the flying saucer and the computer? Well, why did he allow that book to be published?
Gee, let me think. Because it got his name out there, because it made him more famous, because Uri would capitalizes on any publicity possibility he can do, because he knows exactly how the public receives the information.
Was Puharish genuinely, deceitful, or did he...
I think he really believed it. He really believed that.
He
Yeah.
wasn't deceived.
No, he believed that. As far as I know.
He may have been deluded, but I don't think...
Yeah. Just like I think that, according to Keith, Peter Hurkos really believed that his membership card in the Republican Party said that he was working for the White House. I mean, that he said he was working for the White House when Reagan was in office, and he pulls and Keith says, "Show us," because he said he had a card that proved it. It was a membership card in the Republican Party. I guess that meant he was working for the White House because it was a Republican president. There's some strange logic in that, but
A little thin.
really thin. But that's the kind of thing, and Keith really believed that. Felt that Hurkos really believed that. Yeah.
Are there any people out there doing exceptionally good work that we should pay attention to?
Boy, what kind of good work?
Good work in the area that you described in the book.
Dean Radin was doing work at University of Nevada at Las Vegas, but that money's been pulled to be used for survival research.
Survival?
Of bodily death. Yes, that's right. You heard me. Not psi research. That's what it's going to be used for.
Temple just folded up there.
Yeah, Temple folded up their thing. I think the best place to look is in the Journal of the Society for Scientific Exploration right now. That's where it's say for scientific exploration. The SSC. I think that talks about all sorts of things from UFOs to cryptozoology to psi, and they're dealing with innovative stuff. Whereas, unfortunately, in the parapsychology journals, you tend to find the same stuff over and over and over again. If I read one more Gonsfeld study, I'm going to throw up. I mean, I'm so sick of it.
It comes with a barf bag.
Yeah, it should at this point.
So what's Uri Geller doing? Which one?
David, you talked to Uri recently. What's he doing these days? I know a couple things he's doing I can talk about. But
Go right ahead.
you go on the net, check out his webpage. I don't remember exactly what the address is, but he's got $1 million he's got a spoon in a safe and a video camera. And when you log into this special page, you get the picture of the spoon, and if while you're logged in, that spoon bends, you win $1 million. Makes perfect sense, actually. It's long-distance PK. The fact that you log into this, his computer logs in that you're actually the person who's observing it at that time. If the spoon actually bends, he's got it. And to be very honest, that's $1 million that's either A, very safe, or B, well spent. Because if, in fact, somebody does it, that $1 million is worth $50 million in publicity.
So who was that guy that his son said at the meeting? He said, "Dad, my God, when that spoon been next to..."
Dossie's brother-in-law, I don't remember.
I'm his agent.
Apart from being a showman, does he have genuine,
Everybody has psychic abilities.
and his is not extraordinary?
Sometimes. So is everybody else's.
Right, so.
Am I skirting the issue okay, David? What do I say about Uri? Uri has been called by several of the best magicians in the world, the best magician in the world. Okay, Uri has also been called one of the greatest. I like to think of Uri as a psychic stimulant for other people's abilities. I think that Uri, because of his charisma, because of his energy that he puts out, whether he can do it or not every single time, nobody can do it every single time. I would find that extremely hard to believe that even someone who is extremely skilled could get up on stage every single time and bend keys and spoons and things like that. And what do you do if you can't? What do you tell the audience? Sorry, I'm not psychic tonight. Can't have your money back because we rented the hall. So you have to do something else. On the other hand, it's clear that someone like Uri can stimulate other people's abilities because, like Marty said, you kind of break through the belief barrier. You see him do it, even if it's fake. I don't care. Then you can do it. And you're just simply, by seeing the impossible done, it becomes possible. When the impossible becomes possible, you can do it too. And it works that way.
And the watches.
Hey, there's plenty of ways to fake that, and there's plenty of ways for not to. I mean, that's right. I mean, stuff happens. It really, and Uri's found oil wells and mineral deposits, and he's done it, with a piece of the action as opposed to a straight fee up front, and he's made most of his money that way. And when Uri and I did a TV show over in England, and he said, if I was just simply lucky, who cares? I still got all these millions of dollars. And when it comes right down to it, maybe all Psi is an extremely lucky thing.
What is luck?
That's a whole other question.
Wants $3 for that guess for attempting to bend the spoon on his website.
Oh, he wants £3 each time? Well, it's probably just to sign up for it. It'd be kind of hard to translate it.
It sounds like a lottery, though.
Well, you gotta have fun. Get the money coming from someplace.
I'm going to turn the tape around, right?
Okay. Well, I was going to actually take like one more question and wait till you turn the tape, because we're really out of time here, I think. Could be the very. That's right. The most. Does anybody have the question to ask tonight? Because wait. Let me think of the answer first. While he's changing the tape, let's do something psychokinetic real quick.
Write down your answer.
Okay, something a little psychokinetic here. Here, pick a card, any card. Okay, look at it, memorize it, show it to people behind you. I'm not going to find the card because, in fact, this deck reacts to my very thoughts. I have trained it to do that, but it's only learned this one trick because everybody knows you can't teach an old deck new tricks. Place it right on top. Now, place it right on top. Please, place it on top. Because all I'm going to do is cut it in. I'm not going to find the card. That's not the whole point here. This is California. The card's going to find itself. Focus. Concentrate on the card. Come on. Let's try this again. Let's try putting it up against the book here. See if this works. Come on. Maybe not. I think my cards are not cooperating here today.
It's a bad.
Come on. Oh, there we go.
Oh, wow.
Didn't want to stay, though. Is that your card? Sometimes it's harder to think than other times. Okay, do we have that last question? Guess not. Karen. 42. Some people know what that means, okay?
So on your continuum of effects from placebo to mind over matter, do you include spirit intervention here? Like,
if a spirit, you know, when I've done ghost investigations where, in most of the cases that I've done and the people I've worked with who have had apparitional sightings, ghosts, like in the movie Ghost, have not quite learned how to move things. But there are some cases like the Banta Inn and the Moss Beach Distillery and a few other places where... Well, there are some other times, like I said, there are places where the ghosts have learned how to do this. My actual fear after Ghost came out, if you all recall the scene which Patrick Swayze's character has to learn how to move an object, my fear was that there'd be a lot of ghosts in the audience and they'd all learn how to do that too. And unfortunately, we did not have a rash of apparitional sightings with things moving, but you know, you're a little bit more psychically sensitive and they may actually pick up from you exactly how to move things around too. You may be kind of providing them with it. So, well, and the answer is 42, and thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
More books?
Books, tapes.
How much are the books?
$14, $5.50, and $5.99.
$14 for your newest book.
And $14.95 for the tapes.
And 14 is your newest book.
Newest book is $14, right? John, any last words?
No, thank you all for coming, and thank you for a wonderful evening, Loyd. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, John.